Good morning, everybody. We're going to be on time and under budget. My name is Peter Rogoff, and I am the 14th Senate-confirmed Federal Transit Administrator at the U.S. DOT, and I have been serving in that role since May of 2009. I got to tell you, I have participated in a great many TRB sessions over the years, both in this position and prior positions, and I have never been more excited about any more than this one. Last week, President Obama gave a powerful speech on the need for us to continue to address the worsening problem of income inequality, and he noted that 2014 is the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act. Well, not coincidentally, 2014 is also the 50th anniversary of the Urban Mass Transportation Act. To commemorate that landmark milestone, we've succeeded in gathering this morning every Senate-confirmed living administrator of UMTA or the FTA, with the exception of one. And even he has sent in remarks that I'll be sharing with you. It is really and truly an honor to share the stage with nearly all of my distinguished predecessors. This is an ideal opportunity for us to take stock of where we've been and where we're going in the world of transit. We're honored to have with us all of these public transportation experts who lived through and made the history of UMTA and the FTA. I'd like to start by having a conversation about the beginning of the agency. In 1962, President Kennedy sent a message to Congress on the woeful state of our nation's transportation system. In that message, he called the transportation system chaotic, a patchwork, and out of date. For mass transit, he noted that changing demographics, especially the growing suburbs, had changed traffic patterns in ways that legacy systems couldn't adapt to by themselves. The result, he said, was, quote, a steady decline in patronage and a concomitant rise in unprofitability and financial problems, adding, this has been particularly true of rail, commuter, and streetcar services limited to particular routes by fixed roadbeds. What a difference from today, when transit ridership is growing to record levels year over year, commuter rail is expanding, and streetcars are seeing a rebirth in cities from Charlotte, North Carolina to Salt Lake City, Utah. Today, the city of Dallas, Texas, a place where we were once told no one was going to get out of their car or their pickup truck, now runs more miles of light rail than any city in the United States. But back when the Urban Mass Transportation Act was contemplated, there was apparently a different mindset about the relationship between transit and cars. Again, President Kennedy noted, quote, the increasing use of automobiles to meet urban transportation needs has resulted in increasing highway congestion, and this has greatly impeded mass transit service using those highways. The problem was all of these cars were getting in the way of the buses, and something had to be done. In fact, back then, the President asked the Commerce Secretary to consider favorably the reservation of special highway lanes for buses during peak traffic hours. The 1962 message to Congress proposed that long-range federal financial aid and technical assistance be provided to plan and develop the comprehensive and balanced urban transportation that is so vitally needed. It's notable that, like all presidential messages, the President didn't necessarily pen the message himself. It was written by a junior staffer at the White House, and that junior staffer's name was Daniel Patrick Moynihan. The vision embodied in President Kennedy's message would be realized in 1964 when President Johnson signed the Urban Mass Transportation Act, creating a new agency to provide $375 million in capital assistance over 3 years. But even then, as now, controversy surrounded UMTA and the FTA. I couldn't help but notice, as a 22-year veteran of the Senate, I looked into the Senate votes by which this bill passed. The UMTA Act got 52 votes. If we were living in the modern day where you almost have to get 60 votes to pass anything, it wouldn't have happened. But in 1962, public transit was in critical condition. There was real doubt that it would even be relevant 50 years later. But because of the leadership of the individuals on this dais, transit was first put on life support and then stabilized and finally has made a full recovery and is flourishing in ways it hasn't in the past. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you each of these former administrators of UMTA and the FTA. They are in order of their service, going from far stage right, your left, over here to Jim, who's right next to me. We start with Frank Herringer. Frank is chairman of the Transamerica Corporation. He was UMTA administrator from 1973 to 1975 under President Richard Nixon. To his left is Bob Patricelli, founder, chairman, and CEO of Women's Health USA. He was UMTA administrator from 1975 to 1977 under President Gerald Ford. Unfortunately, Dick Page is here in spirit but not in body. Administrator Page is currently enjoying a long-planned family reunion in Mexico, but he did us the great favor of writing to me regarding many of his memories at UMTA, and I will be sharing them periodically this morning during the presentation. Dick Page served as administrator from 1977 to 1979 under President Jimmy Carter. We have Ted Lutz, former Vice President of Communications for the Washington Post. He was UMTA administrator from 1979 to 1981 under Jimmy Carter. Next to him is Al Delabovi, President and CEO of the Federal Home Loan Bank of New York, who was UMTA administrator from 1987 to 1989 under President Ronald Reagan. Next to him is Brian Clymer, former Senior Vice President of External Affairs at Prudential Financial. He was, I believe, the one who bridged the titles. I believe he started as UMTA administrator and went out as FTA administrator from 1989 to 1993 under President George Herbert Walker Bush. To his left is Gordon Linton, Senior Advisor and Principal of 200 Consult Transportation Solutions. He was FTA Administrator from 1993 to 1999 under President Bill Clinton. To his left is Jenna Dorn, CEO of the American Academy of Physician Assistants. She was FTA Administrator from 2001 to 2005 under President George W. Bush. I will tell you with amusement, when you get a phone call on your PDA these days, it shows you who's calling because it looks to your address book and see where the number's calling. Whenever I get called from headquarters, it comes up Jenna Dorn. So I don't know what happens if Jenna actually calls. To Jenna's left, is my most immediate Senate confirmed administrator, Jim Simpson, who serves as commissioner of the New Jersey Department of Transportation. He was FTA administrator from 2006 to 2008, also under President George W. Bush. So please welcome all of these distinguished people with us here today. I've told these panelists that my intent is to keep this conversation as lighthearted as possible. There was a panel here at TRB a few years ago in which then Secretary LaHood convened all of the former secretaries of transportation. It was a wonderful event. People shared reminiscences. Not surprisingly, they shared them more freely depending about how far back their tenure went. Since I'm still in the job, I'm not going to share anything. That's why I'm moderating. But I'd like to start with, I'm going to start actually with one of the reminiscences of Dick Page, because it goes well into my first softball question that I'm going to send out there. Excuse me, I need to get my papers in order. It really has to do with one's baptism of fire. What was the first thing that lit up the office when you started as UMTA or FTA administrator? Dick shared the following. The first challenge arrived suddenly upon my arrival. Within a week of my arrival, the FBI was making headlines for uncovering embezzlement at UMTA. So there was embezzlement. A clerk in the accounting office had been extra conscientious, working late after hours and figuring out how to change the name of some grant disbursement checks to pay himself. And he was living the high life with cars, houses, and other goodies. He fooled UMTA, DOT, and the U.S. Treasury people to great length and at great cost. So I'd like to throw it open. Would anyone like to share their baptism of fire while it up? Go ahead. I'm afraid we're going to have to move the mics around back and forth.
Sure. I'd like to say first, though, that it's kind of humbling to be the senior person in the group. But for those of you who are around 30 out there, you'll never believe how fast you go from boy wonder to senior statesman. Shortly after I arrived as UMTA administrator, WMATA, the Washington system, was being built, and they had, Congress had authorized revenue bonds to pay for the construction of the system. And part of the legislation was that the UMTA administrator, before they issued the bonds, the UMTA administrator had to certify that the principal and interest on the bonds could be paid back out of the fare box. And so this arrives on my desk, and I'm, former management consultant, business school student, whiz kid sort of thing, and I look at it and said, no way. I mean, there's absolutely no way this could happen. I can't sign this. And they said, but Frank, you've got to sign it. And I said, but I can't. They said, but, we can't construct the system unless you sign the damn revenue bonds. And I said, but it's false. So finally I get a call from this, probably from Lutz, at the Secretary's office, that said, Herringer, you sign it or you're out of here. And so I held my nose and signed the revenue bonds, and I hoped and prayed that they never come after me after that.
Well, it's tempting to ask, since a member of the WMATA board and former Deputy Secretary of Transportation, Mort Downey, is here, how did that all work out, Mort? Mort assures us it was all paid off, though I didn't hear him say that it came from the fare box. So go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, I think I had, there was a couple of months, a number of months actually, before I was actually confirmed in the April time frame, and one of the political assistant administrators came into my office breathless and said, we have this bill, it's moving, we've got to move it quick, you've got to get going on this thing, the Secretary's office wants this moved, it's now April, this is going to be on the President's desk by the middle of July. That was the Americans with Disabilities Act, which we finished about 2.5 years later.
Oh, wow.
Gordon, go ahead, please.
Obviously, we've all had these various experiences. One that I remember to this day, I think I wasn't even confirmed either. I had not gone through my confirmation hearing. And I was planning an event, a celebration, bringing all the people that were supporting me down from Philadelphia and around the country. And I asked one of the staff to put a copy of a number of places which I could rent to have that event in the copying machine. And she did. About a week, 2 weeks later, I get a note from the Inspector General suggesting that I'm under investigation, that there's an allegation that I'm using federal funds to run an event for my inauguration. So that was my welcome to the FTA.
Awesome. Jenna,
Yeah,
go
sure.
for it.
All of these memories are bringing back other memories, some of which are not so positive. I think I'm going to have to go for therapy afterwards.
Why don't you, pull the mic a little bit closer to you.
Sure, sure.
Thank you.
Two real memories that are emblazoned in my mind. One, baptism by fire in the first day, and the second in the third month. The first day was when I walked into Secretary Minetta's office for my final interview, and he reaches below his chair and pulls out surely a 1,000-page document and hands it over to me, and he says, Jenna, never again. Never again. I thought, what the heck? And of course it was the Seattle agreement for the New Starts project that had been denied on the last day of the Clinton administration, and we had to figure out with our partners in Seattle how to bring it back from the dead. And his reminder was we should never again be at that point where we have to undo. And so that was the first thing. The second baptism by fire was no doubt needs no description on September 1st, 2001. With the terrorist attack and the total destruction of the PATH station. And it, from there on out, the collaboration amongst the stakeholders and the members of Congress and the FTA superb team in both New York and in Washington pulled together to make a tragic, horrific event ultimately restore transportation in New York. So both of those were very memorable.
I will point out, just because it's notable, the Lower Manhattan Recovery Operation, which began after September 11th under your leadership, continues to this day in terms of, and unfortunately, a number of the assets to which we put hundreds of millions of dollars got flooded in Hurricane Sandy. And we are about the business of restoring them again. So we are still at it, as we will be at Hurricane Sandy recovery for a while. Jim, you have anything you want to share?
Yeah, no, quickly, I had one story, but I think I'll tell another. It was the 2 days, including my day of confirmation. I had a brand new White House liaison that was under the assumption that FTA came under the Commerce Committee for Senate approval, but it was really the Banking Committee. So the Commerce Committee, at least then, according to what I know, it's all secondhand, was like, no problem. Don't take any positions on anything you really don't need to know anything other than how many employees you have at the FTA, and basically go online and take a look at the website and see what you can pick up. Well, the day before, as we were making the rounds, it became obvious to everybody that it was the Banking Committee, which was news for a lot of people. And the Banking Committee, for those of you that do know, they really want to know everything, including what your position is on everything from rail security. So I realized by noontime that did I really want this job? So Matt, you'll remember. So I had 8 hours basically to bone up and learn everything I could possibly learn about the FTA. And the day of my hearing, I know there were 4 questions by the friendly Republican chair, and there were 4 very, very difficult questions. And by the time I answered the second one, I took a look at my watch and assumed that it had been on for an hour, but I had only been on for 10 minutes, so it was the longest day of my life.
Yes, please, go ahead.
So on a lighter note, I will tell you that I got off to an inauspicious start even before beginning. Back in '75, I was living up in Hartford in the time when I was nominated for the job, and the federal government didn't then, and maybe now, doesn't provide any moving assistance or transportation assistance.
Jim could help you out with it.
And I didn't have $2 to rub together, so I was going to move the family down to Washington, and I said, well, I got to save money. I rented a U-Haul truck, jumped in the truck, packed all the stuff, and started driving to Washington. And I ran out of gas on the Jersey Turnpike.
Jim can help you with that, too.
The gas gauge was defective, and of course all I could think of was the headline in the story about the administrator runs out of gas on the way to the job.
Please, go ahead, Ted.
I must say, Bob, yeah, I was head of Metro and once got a ticket for driving on a restricted bus lane. That was not fun. But my early crisis had nothing to do with when I was in the job. It was the confirmation process. Neil Goldschmidt was the relatively new Secretary of Transportation. Mort knows all this. And so this was a political year. I mean, this is 1980, 79, 80. Carter was being challenged by Kennedy for the Democratic presidential nomination. And so there was a lot of tension. Obviously, the urban constituency of this program is a big deal. And so Neil had he was an incredible character. He also had a really temper on him. And so somewhere along the way, Jane Byrne, who was mayor of Chicago, says, I'm switching my support from Carter to Kennedy. Neil quickly responds with, well, that's the last nickel of transit money Chicago's ever going to see. And so my confirmation hearing turned out to be really interesting because they said it was an hour and a half of Neil getting the crap kicked out of him from Senator Percy, you name it. And then they're tired and they get to me and they kind of say basically, now Mr. Lutz, you haven't beat your wife in the last 3 months, have you? And I said, no, good, you're in.
Well, those are great stories. Any other confirmation stories out there that anyone want to share at this one? Go ahead, Bob.
Yeah, this is sort of an interesting story, I think. So I'm
sorry, Frank, I called you.
I'm 30 years old, out of the White House, no transit background, except my father and grandfather worked for the New York City Transit Authority, for what that was worth. And I'm up before the Banking Committee, and Senator Proxmire was taking the lead on the questioning, and he was giving me a working over like I've never seen, and mostly on the age, experience angle, which then I didn't understand. I have a little more perspective on it now. But anyway, he was really beating up on me, and the thing was not going well because, you know, it was sort of lukewarm support anyhow. And the junior senator from Delaware speaks up, who was Senator Joe Biden. And Biden had just been elected to the Senate in '72.
He was very
He
young,
was
too.
30 years
Yeah.
old. And tragically, between the time he was elected and December, it was sometime in December, his wife and daughter were killed in an automobile accident. And my hearing was actually the first thing that he did as a senator. He appeared at my hearing. Until then, he'd been, you know, dealing with his family. Anyway, he took Proxmire on head-on. He said, "Senator, I'm glad you weren't in Delaware during the last election. Because I'm 30 years old, and if I'm qualified to be a senator, certainly Mr. Herringer is qualified to be administrator of the Urban Mass Transportation Administration." Well, he just, I mean, you couldn't lay a glove on him, obviously. I mean, he was, no one would object to anything he said, and turned the whole thing around just like that, and I've had a real soft spot in my heart for Joe Biden ever since.
Very good. I will tell you, while I'm not supposed to tell any stories, I will just say that having worked on transit funding in the Appropriations Committee for a great many years, and periodically doing great bidding for and advocacy for the interests of the Banking Committee, and sometimes going toe-to-toe with them in opposition on things, it was very hard to be a clean slate when you're nominated for these, because they know what position you've taken, you know, every year for the last 17. So, but it all worked out. I want to talk a little bit about the state of the public transportation industry. I mean, at the very beginning, I talked about President Kennedy's observations when he talked about the lack of profitability. I recall this because in making the case to Congress to expand our authority into new safety responsibilities, which we succeeded in doing in MAP 21, one of the observations I made was that this prohibition on the FTA, UMTA, and then FTA promulgating any safety regulations dated from 1964. And in 1964, to give people a sense of the time and place when that policy was considered, there were still 7 major transit agencies in the United States that were paying annual income taxes on profits, which is not something that has burdened any of our grantees of recent. So I was wondering if sort of each one of you would be willing to sort of give a snapshot on where you think the industry was at during your tenure, what was perhaps their greatest challenge, and what the FTA both maybe wanted to do about it and then separately could do about it. And I go in any order that anyone wishes to speak up. Go ahead, Jim.
Thank you. I think for us it was, or at least for me, during my tenure, was state of good repair. I believe during my time as FTA administrator, it was totally coincidental that the fact that I think at that time we had signed more full funding grant agreements during the time period that I was there than any time prior to, I don't know, maybe your tenure. And I think a lot of that, as I said, was just timing. But it seemed that we were having new starts, and there was no talk about the state of existing infrastructure. So in a nutshell, if you have a home, I always looked at the FTA as an investment bank, making a wise investment in transportation infrastructure. You really need to look at the existing plant and infrastructure before you go out and put on an addition. Like if you have a house and the windows are shot, the electrical shot, there's a leak in the roof, how could you want to go on, how could you give somebody the okay to go out and put a 20% addition onto their existing home, i.e. look what WMATA, which a lot of that stuff sort of percolated in 2009 where they had some serious accidents, but they were not alone, New York City Transit and others. So we really pushed hard. I guess it was sometime in the end of '07 to have a dialogue. I think there was a publication we put out beginning the dialogue on state of good repair, and I know now you also, and the FTA has really gone a long way with that. So I think that one of the big things for us was, hey, and there was nothing in the reg that prevented us from stopping a grantee if they met the other very, very difficult, difficult goalpost to meet to in order to get funding for a New Starts project, but there was nothing there to prevent us in the event that the state of good repair was not adequate. The other thing was we didn't even have a definition of what state of good repair, what constituted state of good repair. So I know that it's evolving and it's not where it needs to be yet, but it's certainly it's gone a long way since those days back in 2007, and a lot of which is under your leadership, Peter.
Well, and I want to thank you, Jim, for getting that ball rolling at the beginning. We have asked very direct questions of folks. I got a fair bit of grief for a speech I gave in my first year at the Federal Reserve in Boston, where I was quoted as saying, why should we be participating in expanding your footprint when you can't afford to maintain the footprint you have? That is still our position, but we've also seen a lot of good work. More needs to be done. For example, we are now being presented with desires to expand the Green Line up in Boston. But it wasn't going to go anywhere, and people knew that until Deval Patrick raised a very considerable amount of revenue in order to reinvest in the physical plant of the T as it exists before we expand it. So we're wonking out now, but I want to thank you for getting that ball rolling, and I often credit, I believe that the issue that you raised at the time when they were talking about doing the Silver Line out to Dulles was crumbling platforms on the WMATA infrastructure, and it's something that we have now turned into a formula state of good repair program. And interestingly enough, now that we have state of good repair as threshold tests for a number of things in MAP 21, we are wrestling with what really is the definition of a state of good repair. So the dialogue is still open, and I hope everyone will participate in it. So the question is, what was the state of the industry, and how did UMTA/FTA play a role in addressing its most critical needs? Gordon, go ahead.
I remember...
grab a microphone, Gordon.
Sure. I think the industry was struggling, and I realized that also from having just left the legislature where I served in Pennsylvania, and there was major concerns about the reduction in operating assistance. And as I entered the threshold of the FTA administrator, it became clear that we were going to have to address that. And one of the things that we were able to do was create preventable maintenance that allowed the transit agencies to be able to capitalize many of what was formerly considered operating costs. That was a real lifesaver to the agency because, one, it was allowing them to make that transition, but we also thought it put us much on par with our counterparts in federal highways because many of the elements that they were actually considering capital, we were considering operating. So that was one. The other was a recognition that we were having some difficulties with all the cities wanted to expand into light rail and rail systems, and that we didn't have the financial capacity to do that. But we also realized that we had underutilized buses in many cores around the country. And from that, we launched the Bus Rapid Transit Initiative, which in fact, interesting enough, I took a lot of heat from. There were a lot of rail supporters who were not very happy that the Federal Transit Administrator was speaking on behalf of buses and corridors, which they always perceived as being corridors for rail transportation. And in fact, I had a meeting with some of the largest engineering firms in the United States who wanted to meet with me and want to know why is the Federal Transit Administrator advocating for buses, and why aren't you pushing for rail? And I know today that every one of those engineering firms has a BRT division in their organization, and that BRTs are actively engaged in either planning or operation almost in every major city in the United States. So that was one that I think was pivotal.
Yeah, I'll make a couple of observations. That debate obviously continues to this day. It is worth noting that even in 2014, the majority of transit trips in America will still be taken by bus. Though obviously the ratio changes, kind of creeps almost to half and half the closer we get. The whole notion of allowing capitalized maintenance to be a capital cost I couldn't help but note your observation that it was going to help them make the transition. I think some made a transition, to be honest. Some have never gotten off, never transitioned. They just continue to put all of their, spend a disproportionate amount of their capital money just on preventive maintenance, which has them underinvesting in capital. But that's the trade-off that all the GMs have to deal with. What about from the earlier periods? Oh, go ahead, Al Delabovi.
You know, Peter, it's interesting. I hadn't heard that statistic that you cited at the beginning about the tax-paying transit companies. I think probably one of the reasons they stopped paying taxes was the operating assistance program, because the more they lost, the more they got under that program. And I think that was when we came in the Reagan administration, that was one of the big battles, getting rid of operating assistance and targeting the capital assistance, getting local commitments and moving. And I think, you know, as I look at UMTA and the FTA over, you know, the 25 or so years since I left, there are a lot of contributions this program made to the professionalism of the people in the industry. Think about it. When it started, it was, and I remember Art Thiel saying this when he hired me as the regional administrator. He said, it's a bus buying operation. They buy buses. That's all you have to know. And that was what it was in the beginning. And some of those companies, you know, I mean, whoever was running the bus garage ran the transit system, because whoever owned the buses went on to something else. And there was the training programs. I mean, we used to invest a lot of money. Was that under Section 6? Or I can't even remember these numbers anymore. But there was certainly a lot of money we invested in people in the industry. There were a lot of efforts getting people to work through the Section 8, the planning program, onto capital, you know, targeting capital needs and real results. And I think that's probably the kind of hidden contribution that people forget about when they look at this this program. And obviously in the Reagan administration, we had the penny dedicated to tax, the penny gas tax dedicated to transit for capital. That was a major step. I don't know what it's up to now, but I know it's more. And it all, in my observation, targeted the focus onto the capital needs and what you really needed to do if you're going to run these systems right. And I think that was the state that we paved the way, because it was a rickety, ratchety operation. It was these broken down bus companies. I mean, there were the big transit agencies in the large cities, and certainly there were some of them, but by and large the constituency was all these little bus companies that were then taken over by municipal governments. In many cases, they didn't know how to run them. And so there was a lot of development that had to be done. And you know, you mentioned the embezzlement, and that was before my time. But think about that. That was really the only major scandal in the history of this program. And you know, when I left UMTA, I went across the street. I couldn't say to HUD. I was the deputy secretary, and we walked into Jack Kemp and I, into a scandal-ridden thing. And when you think about it, the transit program, other than that little embezzlement matter, and it was you know, I know it was a big problem for whoever had to deal with it. I guess it was, but by and large, this program has been well run and well administered. And I think we can all take pride in that too.
Please, Bob.
Yeah, I think as you know, you often say the more things change, the more they stay the same. And the organization has come a long way from the very beginning, when it was predominantly research and not a lot of funding.
Sorry, it's Brian. Bob's going to be next. Go ahead, Brian.
I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead,
Did I
Brian.
steal your thunder?
No, Brian, go ahead, please.
I'll follow.
And, I just got confused on the names.
And in looking at where we were at the time, we're probably sort of chronologically, not only chronologically in the midpoint of where the organization is today, but also at a changing point, largely because of the passage of the first iced tea. That changed a lot of the thinking. We had a lot of synergy going between the Highway Administration and Federal Aviation, Federal Rail. That started the whole concept of the intermodal thinking. We got the flexibility as to how the highway funds were used, and that started to change a lot of how people looked at transportation, the emphasis on the multimodal planning, on alternatives analysis, all of that came into to be, which sort of set the stage for good government decision-making, and consideration of social, economic, environmental considerations. So it was kind of a change point in how we started to look at it. But I think you can look at almost any point in FTA's history, even now, and as you look into the future, say, okay, you have to constantly reinvent yourself. Now you have to take into consideration you still have funding problems. From a political standpoint, transportation is like probably number one in importance to our economy, and probably number 10 on a list of 1 to 10 on political agendas. So you have to justify the financing. You have to justify that all of that makes sense, and take into consideration what's changing in our cities and how we need to rethink that, and how transit plays a role in that. And how technology is changing and how that technology gets integrated as well. So there's constant change points. We were one. Every one of these gentlemen went through their own point at some point, but it has to constantly happen again and again.
Bob?
Sorry.
Well, I think way back to 1975, when I came in, it was just a year after the authorization of the Act, and the industry and UMTA were trying to figure out what to do with this pile of money. $7 billion had been authorized. A lot of that was committed. I think only about $3 billion was really uncommitted. And the challenge for us and the industry was, what's a sensible set of rules against which, in particular, new starts should be awarded? And we had a terrific team, and I want to call out some names that are probably fading into memory, but Primo, Orski, Pastor, McManus, great set of deputies, some of which Frank had left me, and over the course of the next couple of years, and this is a history lesson for any new federal program, we had to put in place the rules. Brian mentions alternatives analysis. I think that's when we really put that whole concept together and began to enforce it. We began to suggest that new starts were going to be graded based on their linkage to urban planning and community development. And we were looking for value capture ideas, as some of you remember, and as a new form of financing. We extracted no strike clauses as a precondition for building a new system, for example. We had a good size in those days R&D program, and we threw it open for public comment and tried to gather in annual conferences, try to gather ideas from the industry as how the R&D budget ought to be spent. And most of all, we got the money out. There was a backlog piling up as people were rushing to try to get what was left of that original authorization. So that was, I suppose, our biggest challenge for us and the industry. What are the rules? How do we know how to go forward?
I'm going to share an observation from Dick Page. He had allowed that during his tenure, they inaugurated this thing called quarterly reviews. And we still have quarterlies with all of our major construction projects. However, these ones were done personally by the administrator and the deputy administrator. He said that I and Deputy Administrator Chuck Dingman and other senior managers at UMTA would spend 2 full days on site with each major grantee examining progress on the project. And that was basically the birthing stages of the PMOC program. I travel around the country often, as all of us did, but I think it's been a while that the administrator and the deputy sat there and handled the quarterlies themselves. So it just kind of shows what the maturation of the process has been. I wanted to talk a little bit, and reference was made, I think Brian talked about ICE-T and how that fostered a broader modal dialogue. But it's been interesting. I've been at the TRB conference for the last couple of days and listening to a number of sessions and participating in others. And one of the issues, so now we've had 50 years of this modal administration. And you have to ask the question every so often, do we still have a reason for being? You hear people talk about whether it's time to do away with modal silos entirely. You also hear people fearfully saying that if you do away with that modal identity, you know, things like rail and transit, even in the year 2014, will get rolled over by highways. So I'd be interested in if, you know, some of you would like to reminisce a little bit about what were the modal relationships about back then, and perhaps your own reflections on whether there is still relevance in having an independent, whether it's, let me give you one quick digression, and one of the reasons this falls apart. Well, what's happened under the Obama administration? We've gotten very big into greater inner-city rail investment. So the Federal Railroad Administration, which was almost entirely, they do have an R&D program, but had one grantee called the National Railroad Passenger Corporation, or Amtrak. They had one grantee, and principally was the safety regulator and R&D. They are now making multiple grants to multiple states to foster an inner-city rail program and, for high-speed rail that's with state partners. Meanwhile, the FTA, which has been making grants to hundreds of grantees for capital investment and new service, has gotten into the safety business. So, you know, is this the right order of things? Does it really, you know, in a perfect world, should we have a Rail and Transit Safety Administration separate from a Rail and Transit Investment Administration? Or does that even do away with the synergies that really exist with highways for longer distance transportation? So again, tell us a little bit about what the modal relationship was like during your tenure, and any thoughts you'd want to share on that question. Frank.
I'll make a comment on, you know, how it was 30 years ago, 30 plus years ago. I mean, UMTA was the upstart, right? We'd only started in 1964. It was in 1970 something. Funding was fairly small. Federal Highway Administration, on the other hand, was everything. I mean, they were half of DOT, except they and FAA, I guess, were DOT. The administration, the Nixon administration, had tried to open up federal highway funds to transit and just got rebuffed at every turn, both in Congress and I would say within the department too. The FHA, you know, had its ways of dealing with stuff like that. So, you know, we thought, it was interesting hearing about the end of operating subsidies. We thought one of the great victories was in 1974 when we passed, this is the 40th anniversary of the National Mass Transportation Assistance Act, where we opened up federal funding for operating for the first time. And that was basically an administration initiative with a lot of support from the industry and Congress. But, you know, highways were clearly dominant, and we couldn't put a dent in that, in the armor.
I'm going to make an observation of Dick Page, and then I'll move it around. He observed a different kind of challenge occurred when the administration suddenly, under Secretary Adams, decided to advocate a Surface Transportation Administration, bringing FHWA, UMTA, and FRA together. All the interest groups opposed it. It had a short life in Congress and died quickly. Go ahead, Gordon.
Peter, you know, it seems like that issue continues to occur from time to time. I know, you know, there's always discussions about whether or not the transportation in the entire country would be more efficient if we had one agency. I know under both President Clinton and Secretary Pena and Secretary Slater, we took a couple of stabs at that. We became one DOT. There was a major effort to try to make sure that there was a lot of dialogue, a lot of discussion, a lot of common planning. And one of the challenges always has been the Congress's committee structures of jurisdiction and their willingness to, in essence, play good in the sandbox and give all that up, and their willingness to come together and lose that kind of authority and control. So I think as much as we talk about this theoretically. I think the ability to get that done is going to be a lot of wasted effort. What I see happening more and more, though, is an effort to have flexible thinking and moving in terms of integrated planning and moving our systems together and looking at common corridors and things that we can do jointly in that way. And I think some of the younger planners who are coming out of TRB, I see some of the studies that are going on here over the course of the week, they're coming from a different place in terms of their training. So they bring with them a better understanding of the integration of the modes and beginning to look at that going forth in the country. So I said in that regard, we're in a much better place because many of those who have those silo kind of perspectives, we are retiring and sitting on panels like this and talking about history. And the people in the audience are those that are beginning to think out of the box and thinking that let's look through corridors how we make these systems work because they are systems.
Go ahead, Brian, and then Al.
I think every administration probably kicks around the idea of combining everything into one agency. I think one of the worries that I had was that when you have very technical agencies and very technical groups that are so different, whether it's the Federal Highways or Federal Aviation, Federal Transit, that you're always going to have some degree of specialization. And the question is, by moving smaller groups or smaller agencies into one, is the effect that you get just subsuming the advocate for transit or for rail into a highway organization or into an aviation organization, and you're basically downgrading their advocate. So I don't think I ever saw the wisdom in doing that. And quite frankly, a lot of it goes into the execution. When we were there under Sam Skinner, who was a terrific secretary, Tom Larson, who's the Federal Highway Administrator from Pennsylvania, Gil Carmichael is the Federal Rail Administrator from Mississippi. Sam made us work together. And Gil and Tom and I literally had dinner once a month for the entire administration. We got together, just the three of us, and went out to dinner every month. And so we worked together all the time. And it was amazing how many issues that came up where the staff came and said, okay, the guys in highway want to do this, and you know, we want to do that, and we're supposed to be working together in this, and you know, what should we do about this? And my answer was, you want me to call Tom? And as soon as they knew that we were going to get together or had the ability to, it was, no, we'll take care of it. And everybody worked together. But they worked together because they knew that we had that relationship and that we worked together and that we consulted with one another. And as a result of it, we had a very good working relationship.
I'd agree. Just in the modern day, I think all of us have within the department, no matter who's been Secretary of Recent, have all come around to that way of doing business. It's not perfect by any means, and as part of it, we're responding to different stakeholders and different needs, but it's really in a better place. Al, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I would say that, and we, of course, came in at the tail end after that STA promotion of that concept. I think the transit program needs its own identity. The highway guys, I mean, frankly, the highway administrator that I worked with and served with was Ray Barnhart. You could deal with him when you elevated the issue, but his guys, I mean, think about that organization. It was like a paramilitary organization. And they were all about pouring concrete, and they didn't want to hear about buses and trains and rails. That was just the nature of it. And, you know, Jim Simpson made reference to the fact that they didn't realize, so this is not surprising to me, that they didn't even realize that the UMTA administrator gets, or the FTA administrator gets confirmed over at the banking committee. There was a reason for that. The whole department came from the Commerce Clause of the Constitution, except the transit program. The transit program came under from the Banking Committee originally, and remember, it's the Banking, Housing, and Urban Development, Urban Affairs Committee was the name when it was created, and there was always that interest, and with all due respect to you, Peter, as an appropriations guy, I mean, those banking people did have an urban agenda, They understood it, and we fit into that. Now, ultimately, it's now the Federal Transit Administration. It's not just the urban thing, but there is a place for the transit program, and transit needs are very local. They're very different, and I think they're better served by having their own program because of the differences that we've all talked about here in terms of excellence.
I would point out that Al got help coming and going because Al D'Amato, who was a big ally of and supporter of Mr. Delabovi, at that time, I think, chaired the Banking Committee and chaired the Transportation Appropriations Subcommittee at the same time.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. I worked on his campaign. We went back, you know, many years, and I remember when it came time to pick committee assignments when he was first elected in 1980, because he wanted to be, you know, chairman of both banking and appropriations, but that wasn't possible for a freshman. But he did get he did get subcommittees on each, and those were very carefully thought out. And he maintained that portfolio all along. I think Mort knows that. I mean, there were ups and downs with the New York Transit, with the MTA during that time, but Alphonse D'Amato always had a deep interest in transit and transit things. And, you know, Dick Page writes about quarterly reviews conducted by the administrator. When D'Amato was senator, you had quarterly reviews conducted by the senator and his staff, very carefully conducted, I might add.
Both Jim and Jenna wanted to say something.
Yeah, I think I agree with what Brian had said earlier. To me, I don't think it matters whether you, it does matter whether you have a singular mode for aviation or a railroad or highway, but I think a lot of it has to do with leadership more than anything else. I think from my experiences, both on the federal level and the state level, you need to have seasoned professional transportation folks that stay in these jobs that understand, and we all know, myself included, that the political appointees come in and they very rarely have the subject matter experience in a particular mode, but then again, they can do a good job. But right underneath them, you really need to have those professionals. And at a certain level, I know, once again, my own experience when I was FTA administrator, aviation congestion was really bad. I was traveling back and forth to New York. Half of all the aviation delays are a result of 4 airports: Newark, Kennedy, LaGuardia, Philly, Baltimore, and Washington. Let's call it Washington. And here's a great modal exercise. How do you cut aviation congestion? I think most experts will tell you if you beefed up Amtrak on Northeast Corridor and got rid of those 150-mile, I mean, who would want to take a flight from Philadelphia to New York or Washington to Philadelphia? It makes no sense. You can't do it in Europe. So assuming I was the FAA administrator, for myself to come out and say, look, we're going to cut aviation congestion. We're going to find the funds to beef up Amtrak on Northeast Corridor. Well, that really doesn't happen in the real world, but somebody at the top, at the Office of Policy, at the Secretary's office, and those professional career staff that stay when the politicos come and go, they need to be there and they need to be listened to so those kinds of things can happen. So it really gets to the leadership.
Jenna, go ahead, and I'm going to move to a new topic after this.
Great. Many of my colleagues have made some very wise comments on this particular subject, and mine won't be erudite, but more focused on the practical. I guess I would echo what Dick had said about with respect to structure. I've been in a lot of sectors and a lot of industries as a generalist, can't keep a job, and in every single one of those, there is this discussion about structure and reorganization, and would it be better if we did this or we did that, and it's always, well, it's never a good idea, or it's rarely a good idea because it's so hard to execute. And I did my own version of dum-dum of that, not listening to my own, graduate school readings about never reorganize, it takes all your effort and all that sort of thing. We came up as an FTA team, career and non-career folks, to how to modernize the structure of FTA, and we had all the meetings with internally and externally. We looked at what were the challenges, and we were all raring to go. And then because there was another agenda, uninformed one, on the part of a congressional subcommittee staff, they just stopped it completely. So there was, months and months of work down the drain. Had I been more astute, I probably just would have done the workarounds. For gosh sakes, structure, debating structure, executing structure in the federal government is a no-win.
Well, a number of people in all of these discussions, we keep coming back to Congress. So I sort of wanted to talk about the agency's interaction with and role with Congress. I'm going to pass one observation from Dick Page. He shares the following memory. Senator Magnuson, senior senator from my home state of Washington and chairman of the Senate Appropriations Committee and a political ally of my boss, summoned me to meet with him and the Washington State DOT secretary. They had a cost overrun on bids for new ferry boats, which they considered mass transit, and they had figured out that UMTA might be a good source to cover the extra cost. The challenge, as any administrator can testify, was to say no. I learned quickly how easy it is to say yes, and how hard it is to say no.
Other people's money.
So, Jenna has shared, one of those memories she didn't want to go back on in terms of dealings with Congress, but they are an extraordinarily important stakeholder. Al pointed out the very unique role of the Banking Committee in the Senate, which is Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs. And it's actually, I would argue, has been fortuitous for UMTA and the FTA because senators that tend to gravitate to the Banking Committee also tend to have states that have major urban financial centers, which often means transit, or at least a meaningful presence and role for transit. So I was just wondering if others would like to share when things have gone well with Congress and when they have not. Go ahead, Ted.
For me, I had spent 4 years as Deputy Undersecretary of Transportation, then went to Metro, and then came to UMTA. And what I was stunned at, so I was only there 13 months, but what I was totally stunned at was everybody in Congress, unlike the highway program and these other programs, they had a piece of you. If you were the administrator or the deputy, because every small town was going to buy a bus once in a while. And that meant their congressman needed to have the mayor there, and you had to show up and put on, he got a chance to, make his points. And as a result, you were constantly on the move, and I would only say one of the things that, and the deputy was thoroughly involved in that too, we were never in the office because of the incredible demands, not just of the Congress, but all the other constituents. Far more than 50 states in highway. And that's one of the reasons why we took a shot at creating, and it was great to meet Matt here this morning, the executive director position, which, like highways, it had somebody who was theoretically senior civil servant's caliber, whose job was there to be there. Because I quickly concluded we can't be there. We would never be able to do it because of those demands. Now, one of you guys got rid of it over here, but it's back. It's back.
It's back, yeah.
I killed it. Ralph killed it.
It's back, and I'd be in the grave if we didn't have it. So go ahead,
Peter, I was just whispering with Frank, in my tenure, and I think in his, we didn't have that. The Section 3 grants were not earmarked. Imagine that, guys. I mean, this was the biggest discretionary grant program in the country, and it was actually discretionary.
Right.
And the professionals were making the decisions. So sometime between 1977 and when you came in, Ted, the situation changed politically. Earmarking began, the hustling began. That's not to say there wasn't political pressure. When I was being confirmed, I had introduced myself to a certain important House committee chair who just said to me in a southern drawl very directly, "We're going to get along fine, Mr. Patricelli, provided you take care of my district." Okay, I'd been on the Hill, I understood that, but the point was it wasn't earmarked, they were discretionary grants. Now, I suppose that's the good old days, and we can't get back, but...
Well, actually, they are back. The New Starts program especially has been earmark free for now about 4 years, 5 years, and not surprisingly, the money is flowing a lot more quickly because we know that the projects are ready when we allocate the money. And it's something that I think, at least in the foreseeable future, they just filed a conference report last night that did not contain earmarks for this program. But, you know, part of that is a dialogue challenge. You have to be very clear with them, the members and the staff, who is on the list, what is their status of readiness. It's monitored very carefully. The New Starts team, there's 3 of those folks, Sherry Ricklin, Beth Day, and Dwayne Weeks, still sitting there right there, have monthly calls with the Hill, going project by project through lists, so it comes as no surprise to folks how we allocate money, and transparency is an important part of that trust, and obviously there's a political dynamic that plays into it as well. Go ahead, Jenna.
Well, speaking of dialogue, I'm going to give an example of a not so successful dialogue, which ended up being okay at the end, and I think some of my colleagues in the room, like Matt and Rich, might have been a part of this meeting, in which I was with a prominent senator, aren't they all prominent, from the Midwest, and in his stately office with a dozen staffers, and we were discussing a particular problematic New Starts project in his state. And of all the 30 or so projects, it was the only project where in the forecast of ridership 10 years out, the ridership forecast was lower in the out years than in the current years. So we were trying to make the case that we really needed to get the transit agency to reduce project costs if this had a prayer in the early stages. So after debating this for a number of weeks, really, staff to staff and leader to leader, we were privileged to have a 10-minute lecture from the senator who described every position he'd ever held in the locally and in the state, and et cetera, outlining his experience and why he knew this was the best project in the world. And I lost my cool. And so I said, Senator, this is a shrinking city. He stood up, got within 2 inches of my face, and said, "Who told you that?" And I said right back, "Well, Senator, the Census Bureau." And it was one of those, what's that, exorcist moments where everybody in the room, their heads spun and their eyes bulged out and everything. And so I just felt like, you, Jenna, you ignorant slut, what were you thinking? But I did feel better 2 weeks later because the senator did come around. We had a scheduled conference call with the project manager, and he tore the project manager's head off and said, "You must, Joe, reduce these costs or this project ain't going anywhere." But it was not my finest diplomatic hour, I must say.
Well, yeah. I spent 22 years up there, and I'm not sure I ever saw that. But there's, you know, that's actually one of the beauties of BRT, right? Is we have lower cost, high capacity options, right? That people can really look at. I mean, one of the things we are working very hard in this administration to try and turn the corner on getting better transit in Detroit that needs it desperately, and even Detroit, the Motor City, now gets that thoroughly. They have this painful history of having turned back hundreds of millions of dollars and having built a very small people mover back in the day. We're going to do, we're looking at doing 4 BRT corridors, and with the population drops that they've had, there's plenty of lanes. You don't hear people complaining about taking a lane because it's available, right? So it's really kind of a new day on that. If folks, did anyone else have any reminiscence about Congress? Because I was going to move to another branch called the executive. And where UMTA and FTA has sort of, where it fit within the executive. What help did you get from the Secretary's office and the White House, and what help from those entities you would just assume would have done without? Frank, before you do, I'm going to read a Dick Page Go ahead.
We had a lot of support from the executive branch and from the White House and OMB. We, you know, I think it's pretty consistent that President Nixon and Ehrlichman don't get any of the credit they deserve for their urban and environmental initiatives that occurred in that period of time in the 70s. I mean, a lot of programs, I won't go through them, but they were very supportive of UMTA and our funding. We consistently, and we had an overwhelmingly Democratic Congress, and we would consistently be knocked back. Our budgets would be higher than they were willing to give, and they'd cut us back, which you'd think, never happened, but it happened consistently through our period, and we never had any problem with support from the executive branch.
Bob?
Of course, I came in the Ford administration, and Secretary Coleman and I were on the job during the critical 1976 election. And the New Start money and the modernization grants and the rest of it were piling up, and we were making decisions. And I asked the Secretary, do we need to clear these with the White House? And he checked in, and President Ford's chief of staff, then one Richard Cheney, said, nope, you guys make the best decisions and let the chips fall where they may. And this was an election year. Now, that was an honest view of the way the Ford White House ran. However, Bill Coleman shoveled the money out as quick as he could just before that election.
And it's worth noting that Mr. Ford lost. But there's also, I think importantly, the whole issue of the extent to which the agency is able to do its own bidding versus go through a constant mother may I type of experiences is something where I think the pendulum obviously swings back and forth. This is one of the, to speak for myself, and I'm the one most at risk by sharing internal anecdotes here, but in reality, we, public transportation within the Obama administration takes a very prominent role. We are put on a lot of task force. We're encouraged to do a lot of things because when you think about his talking points on reducing dependence on foreign oil and quality of life of working people, we're sort of lowering greenhouse gas emissions. We're sort of at the center of all of it. But with that comes a lot of oversight, most of which is welcome and most of which is value added and most of which is great partnership with other entities. But that wasn't always the case. I'm going to share an observation from Dick Page, who says he realized, I guess he didn't get very well coached when he first came in and started complaining at a hearing that I think the Section 3 program was basically running out of money because I think in the early years they were sort of authorized for a certain amount, and that lasted as many years as it lasted, and the well could run dry, right? So he started complaining bitterly at a committee hearing that they were going to be running out of money without having talked to OMB at all, and there was at that particular point there was no blessing from OMB to actually ever seek more, and got that wake up. But he says one of the strangest things was there was an odd handwritten note from President Carter to Secretary Adams expressing concern over the high cost of, quote, subterranean tunnels. What other kind of tunnels are there? He says, this was not helpful to my cause. So there's a little White House input. Go ahead, Al. We'll do Al, then Gordon.
Yeah, I'm going to talk first about the three secretaries for whom I worked in the Reagan administration, because each of them, Drew Lewis had a business background that involved mass transit at one point. So though I wouldn't call Drew a transit fan, he certainly knew that who transit was important to, and he had an overall agenda, and he was very skillful, as was Secretary Dole and Jim Burnley, the third secretary for whom I worked. All three of them had a good understanding about how they could have UMTA grease the way for other things that they wanted and keep friendly relations with people on the Hill. And that was a very effective combination. I mean, they were constantly in touch with us. If they needed somebody's vote for something, and there was something that UMTA could do, we tended to do it, and the highway program was more formularized, and we had all these Section 8 we had a lot of discretionary programs where you could do small, visible things that were important in different parts of the country. The White House relationship I stayed out of. They were not friendly to transit. I can tell you that. And I will say this, when Secretary Dole was leaving, there was a party, Jenna, you may even remember this, at the White House, and I had just been confirmed, though I had been there. So this was, Secretary Dole is leaving, the president is there, so she says, oh, I want to introduce you to the president. So she introduces me as the new UMTA administrator, and he said, I thought we got rid of that program.
Go ahead, Gordon, and then we'll do Ted,
Sure.
and then Brian.
I think the first thing that I can remember is my interest in coming to FTA was pretty much based on the fact that I was in the legislature and had done a lot of work on public transportation in the legislature, and I was watching a Sunday morning talk show, and I saw this governor from Arkansas talking about investing in the infrastructure. And I think it was that got me engaged in wanting to work for President Clinton. And from that time on, it was pretty clear we got tremendous support out of the White House, and I had, two good secretaries, one of whom was the mayor of Denver, and being a mayor, you always have some insights in terms of issues that relate to transportation, particularly public transportation. And then there was Rodney Slater, and Rodney came as the Federal Highway Administrator, but also came from Arkansas. And that became very, very helpful as we continue to move through when there need to be discussions with the President from Arkansas, with the Secretary from Arkansas. I think that helped a lot as we try to move a lot of initiatives through DOT. And we also had Mort Downey there. And Mort brings all of that experience from the transit industry, from working at PATH and also at MTA and on everything else. So we had a very strong, both senior level department with the secretaries and the deputies, and good support out of the White House. In fact, I can remember one of the first tasks that I was asked, and it was by Vice President Gore, who told me that I had to get 2,000 buses for the Atlanta Olympics. And he said, but you don't have any money, so figure out how to do it. And we got it done. But he was that engaged in what was going on in our agency, even when we rolled out the BRT initiatives, that he was involved in that as well. So I think we had good support and good direction from both the President as well as the senior executives within the DOT.
Great. Ted, just give me 1 second for one memory, and then we'll go to you. Gordon, I didn't realize I owed you this thank you. You may recall that the way we did get buses to the Olympics is we earmarked funds off of the top of Section 9, then the formula program. And the reason why I owe you a great debt for that is one of the people who came in to the Appropriations Committee to lobby for that was the woman who was lobbying then for the funding for the Paralympic Games. And she and I have been married for 18 years. We have 2 lovely children. So, thanks for making the introduction, Gordon. Ted Lutz.
Succeeding Page there, going into an election year, the relationship with the White House was interesting. Obviously, I worked for Neil Goldschmidt, made his fame on Portland Transit Mall and all that, so he was very much in favor of it. But what I've reflected on since is not completely satisfied with how I did it and we did it, was the issue of how the announcement process, the political announcement process of approved grants was handled. And what's always concerned me was, I look out here at Joel and we had these superb regional people and the grants people who really worked hard. They weren't always right, but they were right 95% of the time, and they tried to make sure that it was on merit. And then you'd get to this somewhat awkward announcement process, and every congressman's there, and it was election year, and there was a lot of discussion and pressure, and actually the White House was pretty good. Well, did you announce it before the California primary? You know, again, it's Kennedy versus Carter. It's a Democratic constituency. And did you do an announcement here and so forth? And while I don't think we screwed it up too badly, there was an issue that I worried about, that could I have done it in a way that still got enough of the political stuff done and yet never cheapened the professionalism of the staff at UMTA?
Well, I'd like to take off on that. Go ahead, Brian, and then I'll follow up on that.
Okay, I have to say, just as a prelude, Al then perfected the announcement process and
Yeah,
brought it
I'm
to
sure.
a new art form. So I inherited that, which was fortunate. But I have to say that we had a lot of support, both from the executive branch and the White House, coming in and beginning with ADA as we did. It had presidential support. Dick Thornburgh and Justice, of course, had the lead on that, but 90% of it was written in FTA. So it all came down to us, and we got a considerable amount of support as that process went on. Sam Skinner, of course, came from Chicago. He was a transit guy there, which was very helpful. So he understood what we were all about. And then following on that, Andy Card out of Boston, another big transit area. So we really had a lot of good support within the executive branch. Harking back to what Al said in terms of his White House thinking that the program had been disbanded, that institutional memory, I think, carried over to OMB. So we did not have a great relationship on the budget side. They tended to want to rewrite my testimony a lot of times when I went in, so I found myself just simply submitting it for the record. And probably one of the most disappointing things with the original Ice-T, one of my personal contributions to that was the idea of changing the name from UMTA to FTA, sort of hearkening back to my own party's and OMB's sort of declination against the urban and UMTA. It occurred to me that if we had federal highways and if we had federal rail and if we had federal aviation, that if we had federal transit, it would make it more of a national priority. It would make it like everything else. And it wasn't going to do anything over the short term, but what I hoped was that over the long term, it would ultimately start to change the mindset of how we looked at public transportation and the fact that it was a national priority. Republicans ride transit just like Democrats do. It was not a party thing. It was not urban versus suburban. And I really wanted to change that mindset. And then unfortunately, OMB, when we submitted the Ice-T legislation in the transit part of it, made us take that out. So it was not going to
And
was not
Congress
going to
did it
happen.
for you.
What?
And Congress did it for you.
Well, happily, the banking committee and a lot of our friends over there had already heard of the idea. And,
Yep. Amazing how that happens, isn't it?
I won't say any more.
I'm not there yet.
I think the statute of limitations is passed, Brian. I think you're okay. I'd like to talk a little bit about the staff, because a number of people had raised it, and I think I'm just going to speak for everyone. This has been a mode that has been extraordinarily stressed and has done an extraordinary amount of things on, fumes and air. And the energy that really makes it all happen has been from the professional career staff throughout, and some of the, I won't offend anyone by identifying them as a senior statesman, but people like, well, she's come back, but Barry Martha Churchman, Doug Burney, who's up there, Richard Steinman, who's down here, and many, many others, Paul Henry and Jaco. Some of these people who have been with the agency for decades not only provide the memory, but also provide still the creativity. Scott Beal, who's been with the counsel's office a great many years and has kept many of us out of trouble over a very long period of time. I'm going to read a observation again from Dick Page, because I think it's really noteworthy. He's, in terms of disappointments, he says, "We were unsuccessful in persuading the Congress to authorize more staff at UMTA. In those days, the ceiling was about 510. But actual staff was probably 10% less, too few to oversee effectively a growing multi-billion-dollar program spread across so many grantees. It was satisfying, albeit a little late, when the lead House staffer, Tom Kingfield, who I used to work with as well, told me as I was leaving that they had erred in not authorizing more staff. 510. That's where FTA is roughly today. And our budget is getting closer and closer to $11 billion. And it is through, obviously we have some contracting resources, but it is, our eyes popped out to note that they recognized then that it was woefully inadequate in terms of the charge that the agency had, and it still is to this day. I will say, while it is, the conference report filed last night for 2014 I believe we've sort of finally turned a corner where we're going to uptick to, I think, what is probably a historic high in our admin budget, and allow us to start hiring not just for our new safety function, but for the core functions of the agency. It will not be anywhere near where we want to go. But I'm sure many of you have, I mean, I know for a fact, because I was at least working the appropriations angle while at least halfway down the table we're serving as administrator. It's been a huge stress on the agency that has so much to do, so I thought some people might want to share observations on that. Go ahead, Jen, and then we'll do Brian.
Yeah. Well, certainly, I'd like to echo what you said about this, about the staff. One attribute that I think is really important, and it harkens back to something Brian said a moment ago, that an agency like this, and probably any agency in government, has to, in order to remain relevant, has to continue to reinvent itself. And staff, in addition to competent leadership and innovative thinking, they also have to be flexible, because as you can hear the stories up and down this row, the context changes in every leadership post, and each trying to build on the other to make the organization better in a different environment. And when you think about the business sector and how businesses reinvent themselves, mostly by going out of business and doing something else, that doesn't happen in our federal government. And I honestly believe, with I think the rest of the panel as well, that FTA was very fortunate to have, is very fortunate to have people, not only all the attributes you mentioned, but also that they are passionate about this as a transit benefit. And it was a joy to work with them.
Brian.
I would echo the same thing. It was an extremely passionate staff. When I got there, Al's administration that was trying to kill it had gotten it down to 400 people, and so we were stuck at 400 for the time that I was there. I came out of Philadelphia. I'd been on the transit board up there, so I certainly understood transit, at least from a macro sense. I'm a CPA by training, so I had a financial background, but really didn't understand the workings of the program. And I walked in there as a neophyte and sat down with the staff and said, okay, teach me, just brief me. And they did a phenomenal job. We spent weeks studying it and going through briefing material. What a talented group. They were, I just can't say enough about how supportive they were in helping us out, helping me out through that tenure. And probably the best way I can describe it, and one of the most gratifying comments I got, was at a farewell party when Bob McManus came up to me and he said, you know, Brian, we ran for 4 years. We really ran. He said, but it was fun. And that kind of describes it. I couldn't wait to get into work every morning. It was just, we had a ball. It was just a great time and a great organization.
I should point out, we sought to see if Bob McManus could join, at least to be in the audience. There's only one FTA. Bob McManus served as the acting administrator for so many times, for so long, in so many frequencies, while there were vacancies in this position, that only one FTA administrator has served longer than he has.
None of them better.
Gordon, did you want to say anything?
I just want to say, and I'm glad you mentioned Bob McManus, because I was actually thinking about him as we were talking about the staff and how helpful he was to all of us, I would imagine, as administrators, in terms of making that transition from coming from the dark side of the world to the agency itself. But clearly, the staff and the passion that Brian made reference to is often something that we all benefited tremendously. And some of the things that staff did to leverage their smallness, if I can use the word, the ability of that agency to be 500 in number and be able to responsibly manage the level of resources that we had was incredible. One of the things that did come out of my tenure in Hiram Walker, who passed away recently, was very much engaged in that, but it was electronic grant making. That was an incredible transition for the agency, who had all that responsibility for managing grants, and it was so paper intensive. Right. But the electronic grant making process was a major transition for the agency. And I recall, similar to mentioning early on about your concern about signing on a letter where you were responsible for bonds, Hiram walked into my office and told me to push this button, and I was going to generate transition. I think it was about $10 million to an agency. And I said, I'm going to do what? He said, just push the button. And $10 million is going to New York right now. And I was like, I don't know if I want to do that. I can't take it back. The paper, I can always go back in one of the offices and say, we made a mistake, and pull it back. But that was just one of those things that occurred that was phenomenal. And it came out of the staff as another way to leverage what we were doing and doing it in an efficient way with small numbers.
Absolutely. I'll just make one observation that by the way, we now have the regional administrators pin the grants to insulate the administrators from that responsibility. But there is, we are now doing the next generation of team and in new modern open architecture. One of the things we have with staff at the FTA is we have recidivists, as we like to refer to them. We have folks who leave the FTA often to get a grade increase in another department or another mode. They very often come back. And I think it has a lot to do with the spirit of camaraderie, the nimbleness, the fact that you could be at FTA and you can get thrown into 17 different issues in a day because we don't have 17 different divisions to handle it. Go ahead, Frank.
Yeah, Bob McManus was there when I got there. I wish I could take credit for hiring him. And somebody should get word to him how many times his name was mentioned in this session. He's a consummate public servant. But I just wanted to mention that I second all the comments about competence of the people that I worked with. And one of the things I was able to carry over into my private sector career was an appreciation and empathy for the environment in which people work in government, and particularly the risk-reward trade-offs that they make. And how I explain it simply is that in the public sector, there's almost no reward for taking risk. And there's tremendous downside if things don't work out the way you'd hoped. In the private sector, you understand more or less that, things are probabilistic. You can make very good decisions that 90% chance they're going to work, 10% they don't. And it's going to have a bad outcome, but that doesn't mean it was a bad decision. There's no appreciation of that in the public sector, whatever. You get crucified for making a mistake, quote, and you get a pat on the back maybe for doing something that involves some risk. Thank goodness for all of us that there are many people in the public sector who nevertheless are willing to take some risks.
Thanks. Jim, and then we're going to do a quick lightning round.
Yeah, on a personal note, I've always had a very difficult time sleeping in my life, except for my time at the FTA. I used to go home and sleep like a baby because I was never so psychologically challenged. The most thinking and analysis I've ever done in my life was at the FTA because some of the best and brightest people work there. And I think, once again, passion just shines through with everything they do at the FTA. It's just an incredible workforce.
Well, thanks for that. We have about 15 minutes left. And what I was hoping to do is sort of just go down the line, and maybe we'll start with Frank, and work our way left. For everyone to sort of identify, I'll give them a choice. Either their single largest achievement and/or their single largest disappointment, and/or What was the issue you inherited that you wish your predecessor had closed out and taken care of before you got there?
Well, I would say my single largest disappointment was our inability to get our hand in the cookie jar of the Federal Highway Administration funds.
You know, my biggest disappointment was Jerry Ford not being reelected. But on the positive side, and it was almost all positive, just two quick highlights. One was opening the Washington system in March of 1976. You know, the 7th rapid rail system in the country, a huge achievement, not mine, my predecessors, my successors, but we're all stewards in our brief time of service, and these projects are 20 and 30-year projects, and we just have to do our part. That was a great high. And secondly, I would say, I think we planted the seeds in the mid-'70s for trying to make the UMTA, now FTA program, a linchpin of urban development. As some people here have said, it's not just about transporting passengers, it's about shaping cities and suburbs, creating value in land, affecting real estate development, and it's hugely important to our cities. It continues to be.
Actually, Ted, I'm going to ask you to hold, because I'm going to fill in for Dick Page, and then we'll go. Dick really credits a couple of his greatest accomplishments. We approved the largest letter of no prejudice ever to support the design and construction of a new rail station at the Atlanta airport. And it really was about the fact that while they were a long way away from being able to build MARTA out to the airport, they were already about the business of building the new terminal, and they've had the wisdom to say, we're only going to do this once, both to finance it and do all the construction. He also pointed out Governor Goldschmidt of Oregon wanted an interstate transfer, who had this idea that he wanted to transfer his highway money back and get transit money instead. And indeed, that did become the first interstate substitution grant, which would eventually get codified as a mechanism which built part of the metro system. I mean, a lot of people don't realize this, but Interstate 66 was not supposed to end at the Roosevelt Bridge. It was supposed to plow right up to the Capitol. And instead, the district used interstate transfer to build more miles of metro instead. We are still administering interstate substitution money in Wisconsin, I would point out. And we would like them to move on with it. But it is, nonetheless, go ahead, Ted, you're next in order.
Biggest regret, not working carefully enough or respecting their role in the system of the suppliers and manufacturers. In that 13 months in election year, I mean, they deserve to be better and deserve more of our attention, and didn't get it. Secondly, the achievement that you felt best about for me, and Brian, you may recall some of this, I don't know how long you've been involved, was a rail car purchase in Philadelphia for the SEPTA system. 1980, again, election year, Buy America had just become sort of part of the federal rubric, and we didn't have a clue how to do it. So you have one remaining U.S. manufacturer of rail cars, the Budd Company in suburban Philadelphia, and they bid for rail cars. We're paying whatever percent it was, 70, 80. And who wins? Who's the low bidder? KHI, Kawasaki Heavy Industries. And trying to figure out, you can imagine the pressure on that one. And, you know, there was no basis for really throwing out, I mean, the difference in the bid was, you know, a sizable percentage. You know, it wasn't close enough. Well, I hate to say close enough for government work, but there wasn't close. And there was no way you could jigger this if you wanted to make Budd the winner. But this was a massive political problem, a huge one. Bill Green was the mayor of Philadelphia, no shrinking violet. And thing I feel best about, we had, the staff said, you cannot overturn that low bid. I said, yeah, okay. And so basically we worked with Mayor Green, finally came up with the ideas, look, how much are we saving here? $10 million. They'll build a plant in the U.S. or something, Kawasaki, and, oh, you have the ugliest rail lines that down the Broad Street, Vine Street, the stations in Philadelphia. I used to describe them as similar to the men's restroom at the old Connie Mack Stadium. You know, one single light bulb hanging down, dirty, crummy. That was Vine Street. So what if we took the $10 million and had a cooperative program to refurbish the stations along that Broad Street line? You know, it was one of those ones where he said, well, I can't really let you off that too badly, but I won't kill you. Good, that was good enough at that point. And the Kawasaki cars are still running, I see. I went on their website last night, and they're still going.
And we have a Hyundai Rotem railcar plant in Philadelphia. Al?
I'm going to take a little liberty because I was sort of a part of a triumvirate of administrators, two of whom have passed on but deserve mention. The first is Art Thiel. And I think Art worked very hard to bring some discipline to the organization. It had grown very rapidly, had some problems, and he worked on that very hard, worked very hard to achieve the penny for the transit program, the dedicated source of funding. And I think in that process he brought credibility to UMTA that wasn't there when people were talking about a Surface Transit Administration. It was one of the reasons why there was an attempt to subsume UMTA into that. So that was Art. And then, of course, Ralph Stanley, the cost-effective analysis, taking alternatives analysis really to the real degree, and ultimately the first full funding contract in Los Angeles was Ralph's achievement. He laid the groundwork for the project management oversight, the contracting of that I think is still a part of it. And of course, the private sector initiatives was the hallmark of Ralph's time and something that I picked up when I was there. I also had the quarterly grant approval. You talked about the political process. We decided, and Ralph supported me, and Secretary Dole agreed to it, that we were going to, if a grant came in at the beginning of a quarter, it was going to be released by the end of the quarter if it was processed. And I understand that that's been carried, Peter, under your leadership to, I think it's 30 days, they tell me now. So that politics that was referred to earlier was taken out of it. And I want to just close by seconding the comments. It was a great staff, and is a great staff. And I've had the privilege, I went over to HUD as the Deputy Secretary, and there were some great people there, and of course 21 years at the Federal Home Loan Bank. But the fun years were the UMTA years, and that's because of the people that were there, some of whom are still there, and from what I hear.
You're still some of them.
And some of them are still there, and I think that they've been able to rejuvenate and continue to attract people. So if you're getting a bigger head count, Peter, I hope you keep your hiring standards high, because you want people with passion for this program.
Well, and the thing is, Al, they're out there. I mean, there's an extraordinary number of young people, especially in the planning community, for whom, working at the FTA, I get approached by folks all the time that want to come in. So it's really great. Brian.
I think in following on what I would look at as probably one of our greatest successes, following on to Frank's comment about his greatest disappointment not getting his hand in the Federal Highway cookie jar, that probably one of our greatest successes was getting our hand in the Federal Highway cookie jar in iced tea, which we talked about a little bit earlier, which I think was a real turning point in how we think about transit and the whole concept of intermodalism. But besides the attitude name change, which I was very personally invested in, the other piece of that I think I had a big, I invested a lot of personal capital in, was the reinstatement of the transit research program here in TRB. It had gone by the wayside and had not found its way back in for a number of years. Bill Millar approached me, he was in Pittsburgh at the time, approached me early on in our administration, handing me a book on the STARS program and asked me to read it and tell me what I thought. And I read it and sat down with him and I said, hey, you know what, we ought to do this. And my idea was that the way to get it back in and present it to Congress was to do it as close as possible to what they were doing for the Federal Highway Program. So that when we brought it up to them, it had the look and feel of the Highway Research Program. It took a lot of doing, thanks to, ultimately to Bud Schuster at 2 o'clock in the morning and on a Sunday night when the transit program went through and Ice-T. He was shuffling his AA in and out, and I was sitting out there, and we got the language in and got that done, and that was something I feel really good about. I know you're taking a hit on it, but hopefully at some point it'll come back up again.
Yeah. TCRP lives on, albeit at a smaller level, but we're also finding contributions from other places too. So, Gordon.
Thanks, Brian. I'm glad you were able to work on establishing that. I was a little concerned that it was taking a hit and kind of diminishing. I was hearing more and more about that while I was here. But let me just say, I mentioned earlier about a number of things that we thought we did fairly well in coming through FTA, the bus rapid transit, the liberal communities, electronic grant making. I guess I had the advantage of being there for a long time, and that allowed us to do a lot of good work. I think the most difficult day I had, quite frankly, was my last day. Having been there with this great staff for so long and having done so much, the most difficult day I had was saying goodbye and gathering all my staff and talking about both what we had done, what they will continue to do, but the fact that I was leaving the agency. I think I've heard several colleagues say that working at FTA every single morning when I got up, it was a blessing. Felt good about going to work, felt good about what we were doing as an organization, and really felt that it was having a major impact on the lives of people throughout this country. And as we got a chance to get around the country and look at the projects, but also to touch the hands of people who were affected, we got that feedback, that the kind of impact that it was having on their lives. And I think we heard earlier that the transition from it just being a bus program to recognizing that it really was shaping America and touching lives and moving people in a way that really affected what they did, but what they actually were going to become. And I think leaving that was a big challenge. And that's why so many of our senior members stay, because they just enjoy what they're doing, and they feel it every single day as well. So it's a great agency, and we're all blessed to have been part of it.
Great. Thanks for putting this panel together. I think it's been very fun. Just two quick things that represent for me two team accomplishments, and they were truly involved hundreds of people. One related to a hot mess of multiple agencies trying to regulate transportation for the elderly, low-income, and disabled people. Each of the agencies had many regulations that they thought were protecting the integrity of their funds, like making sure that a Medicaid recipient could only get a transportation voucher if he or she was going to the doctor, but not if they were going to the grocery store. Some of those dumb kind of rules, which make it very difficult in order for us to serve the public in the way that FTA wanted to do that. So FTA team really jump-started something that many of my predecessors worked on as well, and created a program called United We Ride. And we got a lot of effort from the states and inspired competition and practical solutions to kind of move this forward. We put it on a higher profile. I think we made a dent in a decade-old problem. It's still ongoing, and I know there's a commitment across this administration's and subsequent ones. The second most proud element, I would say, is no doubt the collaborative strategy post 9/11 by the industry and with respect to transit security, when everyone else was paying attention to airline security, our transit leaders and our FTA leaders and Mike and others really embraced this. How can we work together to figure out how the riding public can be protected in a post 9/11 environment? That also went to the collaborative strategy in New York with hundreds of stakeholders in the community, trying to figure out how do we restore and modernize the PATH system, the PATH station, and all of the transit hubs that went through it. Working together to figure out how to do that in real time was incredibly, it was one of, I think, FTA's and our stakeholders' finest moments after a tragedy. And it almost didn't happen, so I'm going to end on just a very quick note of somewhat humorous about FTA having responsibility and oversight for this, and we had a lot of support in Congress for that, having that happen, but FEMA was dragging its feet for weeks, refusing to sign an MOU that would give FTA the responsibility for overseeing the $3 billion New York Recovery Project. They were refusing to sign it, and the White House intervened to have this meeting between FEMA officials, FTA officials, and our Deputy Secretary. So we went over to the White House to have this meeting, and FEMA insisted they wanted to have the oversight. We went back and forth. The Deputy Secretary, Michael Jackson, was there, and at one point the FEMA official said, well, what do I tell my regional administrator, because he really wants to manage this program? And Michael Jackson just gave that steely-eyed look to this FEMA deputy and said, tell him to get over it. And the issue was resolved. FTA was proudly the leader, the overseer, the collaborator, the partner in helping to rebuild New York.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Jen. I'm going to take a quick parenthetical twist, and then we'll finish up with Jim. In fact, today, in the wake of Hurricane Sandy, we were very fortunate. Back in 2011, the Obama administration started advancing an emergency relief program for transit on a par with highways. It's not unlike what Alan Bryan were talking about on TCRP. Is let's set it up on for parallel treatment with highways. And when the president transmitted a $60 billion package for Hurricane Sandy relief to the region, one of, if not the largest piece of it, was $11.7 billion for the newly authorized FTA emergency relief program. And now we are overseeing and putting to work rapidly billions of dollars for the transit agencies to not only repair but also to make their systems more resilient. So that tradition continues to this day. Jim, we're going to finish with you.
Thank you. I think something, when I look and I see my fellow administrators, one thing sort of rings clear. It's almost like the Athenian oath. I think that all of us, including my successor, we all, I think, really at the end of the day have one goal. It's really to leave the organization in a better place than when we found it. And it's obvious when you listen to what everybody said here this morning that they were successful in doing that. And I know, Jenna, I followed you, and I know that you made some structural changes that you'd like to make, but Congress stopped, but you left the place in outstanding shape for me, and you made it very easy for me, a lot of good appointments. And during my time, with everything else going on in New Starts, we focused a lot on the Malcolm Baldrige program, where we were one of the first federal agencies to apply for the Malcolm Baldrige Award, and we did a lot in employee development, taking things off your plate, trying to streamline the organization. But one thing I was never successful at was to streamline the New Start. So I hope, Peter, that you can, you've done that.
I think between our regulations and our MAP 21 advances, I don't want to take this as an accomplishment because it's a little too personal. But when I got to sign the letter saying that Jenna Dorn's March 8th cost-effectiveness letter is no longer in effect, that was one of them.
That's why my name is still
Yeah.
on your cell phone.
Listen, it was getting kind of hard when I got there, if you don't mind my just adding a little more, because it got to the point where we were saying, well, do they really need rail cars on this New Start? If we cut that out, the project will be cost-effective. So.
Yeah, we try to be a little bit more comprehensive than that. Anyway, a couple of very quick announcements. One, as is obvious to everyone, but I'm required to announce it at a TRB event, this session has been videotaped. I particularly want to say thank you to Jared Stoltzfus and Jennifer Weeks, who've put a lot of work into putting this session together. Please join me in thanking again all of my predecessors for all of their efforts. Thank you so much for coming.